what we have learned is that sovereignty without people's aspirations and the old monolithic concept of nation state and sovereignty is negotiable, and perhaps we are very much attached to these notions, which are a great source of conflict between India and Pakistan. Now I request, we'll come back to this in the open session. I now request Dr. Akmal Hussain, a very able economist, and associated with the idea of SAARC and the South Asian Union. I request him to kindly make a brief presentation.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard a fascinating examination of where we were and where we are, perhaps to provide a basis of where we could go from here. Aisha Jalal brought, for me, and I'm sure for most of you, a sense of history on the basis of which we could re-examine some of the premises which have brought India and Pakistan into such a long-term kind of conflict. And I think that sense of history is a very therapeutic thing, because it will help us to reconstruct a shattered present. And as you know, the future, in a sense, is also contained in the present. So in reconstructing the present and re-examining our premises through a historical sense, perhaps we could lay the basis of a better future. Now, I think in the same kind of mode of thinking, if you like, what I'd like to do in these very few minutes is to indicate the historic moment in which South Asia is placed today, some of the principal challenges that it faces, and how in addressing these challenges, hopefully successfully, we can build a better future. My sense is, and I've been arguing this for almost a decade, that South Asia is at a conjunctural moment in its history. And this moment can be defined in terms of three broad dimensions. The first is that there's a seismic shift taking place in the center of gravity of the global economy for the first time in perhaps 2 centuries, from the West to this part of the world. At present trends, or the trends that existed about a decade ago, if you project these trends, by about 2030, or the middle of the 21st century, China will become the world's largest economy. And India, in all probability, will become the world's 3rd largest economy. But if we achieve an economic union in South Asia, as we all hope we can do, then South Asia, in fact, will become the world's 2nd largest economy in the coming decades. So in other words, China and South Asia together will constitute the greatest economic powerhouse in human history. And I think this is a prospect that's a very real one. When I said this about a decade ago in the South Asian Parliamentarians Conference, which we organized in Bourbon, there was some skepticism. But I think now, after almost 10 years, even the BBC has begun to propound the idea that there is some kind of seismic shift taking place, and India and China or South Asia may be on the cusp of a new sort of preeminence, or for the first time, a new kind of preeminence at the global level in terms of their economic prospects. So that's the first very interesting aspect of the present moment, the fact that South Asia could emerge as a leader, if you like, as a global leader as far as the economy is concerned. The second unfortunate feature is that in spite of 2 decades of historically unprecedented economic growth, South Asia is still home to half the world's poor. And given the structure of the growth process, if this economic structure within which the growth is taking place in both India and Pakistan, and indeed in the other South Asian countries, there is very little likelihood of dramatically improving the poverty situation. Now, if you look at the Indian case, which I think sharply brings out the point I'm trying to make, is that they've had an average 8% GDP growth rate over the last 2 decades, and that's what's catapulted them into becoming a major economic sort of world leader. Yet, the latest estimate by the Tendulkar Commission points out that something like 37% of the Indian population is living below the poverty line. In the Pakistani case, we've had a mixed record of growth. We've had a kind of up and down growth process. But even in the Pakistani case, the average growth rates have been pretty decent by global standards, around 4.5 to 5%. And yet, at the end of 5 or 6 decades of this high growth, relatively high growth, something like 35 to 40% of Pakistan's population today is living below the poverty line. And the poverty line is a rather sharp one because it refers to a calorific norm. So those who are below the poverty line are actually going hungry. They don't have enough to eat, let alone have enough to look after themselves if they fall ill, or to have any money left over to lead what Bardhan has called a dignified life. The third interesting feature of the present moment is that, as you know, the climate change associated with global warming, which has affected the world and is affecting the life support systems of the planet, I think in South Asia, more than in any other region of the world, South Asia is more vulnerable, both at the social, economic, and political and human level. It's more vulnerable to the consequences of climate change compared to any other region of the world, and I'll just point out why. Very quickly, to sort of indicate the basis of this proposition, is that something like 65% of South Asia's population depends on directly or indirectly on agriculture. And as you know, agriculture in South Asia is critically dependent on the monsoons. Now, the one thing which this climate change is doing is that it's making the monsoons more vulnerable. Associated with this is, as you know, the report of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climatic Change has informed us that the intensity and frequency of extreme climatic events will increase, which means that you're going to have droughts combined with floods. Other things remaining, forget the monsoons. Droughts and floods directly associated with global warming in South Asia. And we're already in the midst of that, you know, this year. Pakistan had floods a couple of years ago. Now we're facing droughts. So this climate change phenomenon, with the variability of the monsoon, means that large parts of the South Asian population are likely to be displaced and society is likely to be destabilized. Now, I've got a table here to illustrate this, but unfortunately we don't have arrangements for so I guess we don't have the arrangements for that. So I'll very quickly take you through this rather grim picture that we have on the environmental front. Now, there are 3 dimensions to this. One is the issue of water coming through the rivers. The second is the issue of how temperature increases directly affect crop yields because our grain crops, grain seeds, are highly sensitive to temperature. And the third is what is happening on the coastal plains, because a large part of the South Asian population is dependent on coastal agriculture. And rising seawater levels associated with global warming are going to salinize these agricultural plains and displace about something like 125 million people in the next 2 decades. Now, as far as the water is concerned, this has become a rather immediate issue. The Indus Basin currently has about 1,329 cubic meters per capita per person available on an annually. Right? Now, the minimum requirement for sustaining normal human and social life, there's a general agreement on that, is about 1,700 cubic meters per person per year. So in other words, the Indus Basin is already, excuse me, a water-stressed basin. We are already short of water in the Indus Basin. It just so happened that 63% or 67% of the water in the Indus Basin is used by Pakistan, so Pakistan feels it more sharply. In the Indian case, they appear to be sitting pretty, because the Ganges-Brahmaputra Meghna Basin currently has twice the minimum water requirement. It's about 3,500 cubic meters per person per year. But before we start suffering from the illusion that all is well in India, the projections show that by 2025, India will also get into a water stress situation. And the water availability in India by 2025 is going to be about 1,140 cubic meters per person per year, which is substantially below the minimum 1,700 requirement. So what we're facing, ladies and gentlemen, in South Asia is a major water stress crisis for Pakistan today, for India in the next 10 to 15 years. Then there is the problem of the water runoff. The volume of water in the rivers is going to dramatically change, because the Himalayan glaciers, unfortunately, are melting at an average rate that's faster than the global average.